Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk today about refugees and refugee communities. And I suppose the question I want to pose for all of us is, what kind of refuge do we think our countries and our home nations offer? And that's really, I think, the crux of it. And I want to start really with a picture that an Afghan refugee drew for me. So he's 17 years old. He came quite a few years ago. And we asked him to depict for us his life so far. So in line with the Farsi script, which goes from right to left, he depicted his life as well from right to left. So on this side, I don't know my life to rest, let alone in this side. Anyway, so in this side, he starts with his life in Afghanistan. Now, he just drew it, and I'm not going to interpret it. I'm not a psychoanalyst in any way, but the red to me seems an incredibly painful part of his life. And there are two graves he's drawn of his parents. And then he draws Iran. Now, I'm actually ethnically Iranian, although I've never been there. I live with this fantasy that Iran's an amazing nation, but I've never been there because I come from a persecuted group. And he draws 2 years in Iran, so he had to leave Afghanistan. His companion with whom he traveled was shot in the mountains in a very treacherous journey that many of these Afghans make into Iran. Iran is one of the countries with the highest numbers of refugees in the world, but actually, like from his depiction of those 2 years, it was a horrific experience for him, living on the streets, fearful of his life, trying to find a way out and to safety. Following that comes quite a long journey. Out of Iran, finally, across the Mediterranean Sea. Actually, his other new friend did drown. And this happened before that the Mediterranean crisis came to public awareness like it is. This has been a long-standing problem. And then he arrives in England, which is the last kind of spot. So a little bit of green, I don't know whether you can see, is peeking through in that picture, but still a lot of red remains. And I think for me, this is the crux of it and why I'm really interested in this, that actually there is very little I think I personally can do to prevent what happened in Afghanistan, what happened in Iran and his journey. But my God, I think it is completely unacceptable that the red still remains in a country of refuge, especially developed high-income nations such as the ones that many of us represent. I think it also represents why this group, from a mental health perspective, I find particularly interesting, because they represent, in a way, many of the stresses that we think are important to prevent or try and mitigate when working with any young person. So he's experienced living in an environment of violence. He's witnessed parents killed. So these are kind of acute, dramatic life stresses for any individual, let alone a child. He comes from an area of community disruption. He had very, very little education. He then traveled, and then I suppose he enters this, long journey in a way similar to what Faye was talking about today, of finding a place that feels accepted and that actually he can call home. And this kind of desperate quest for belonging that we see in many of our communities. I also just want to say that actually they also represent the most remarkable group of individuals, because if we're interested in resilience and understanding about how people can manage stress, how we can all learn about these things, actually refugee communities can teach us more than most. So actually looking at this picture, I want you to just be aware of the fact that the refugees that end up in countries that are high-income nations, like Ireland, like Canada, like America, like Australia, are actually not a representative group of the refugees around the world. They're a very, very small, unrepresented group. And that reason is because this is a young boy, 13, 14, living in a village in the mountains of Afghanistan. Now, if this boy can make it to a school in Oxford, it is, I think, quite unbelievable. This is the most resilient, resourceful, quite unbelievable human beings we've got arriving in our countries. they're not necessarily representative of the overall refugee crisis. They are actually a group from whom we should be just kind of celebrating and welcoming in a manner, because actually, you know, you think about it, you think about many of these families that have to take these very difficult decisions, that actually they have to leave, but they only have enough money to send one member of their family over. They're going to choose that one individual whom they think is the most capable, the most strong, the most resourceful. Then they arrive in England, for example, and my gosh, what do we do to them? Well, we definitely make sure they feel unwelcome. We might make them move many, many times. We definitely don't give them refugee status. We have a refugee acceptance rate of less than 10% right now. We change the law so that you're not a child at 18, you're a child now at 17 and a half, so we can deport you as soon as possible. And also we build kind of detention facilities. So, you know, I once gave an interview over 10 years ago, and someone asked me to predict what would happen, and I predicted that we would close all detention centres. And, you know, some of my friends just always laugh at me, because the absolute opposite has happened, that actually we've quadrupled our detention capacity in most high-income nations in the last few years. So kind of placing these incredibly vulnerable groups in institutions like detention centres. In Britain, we use detention apparently as a stepping stone to deportation. We make sure that those people who are put in detention never stay in the detention centre for more than a couple of weeks at a time, so that the local population can't build the resources to start advocating for their needs. So when we think about the post-migration environment, I think there is a lot that we can do, and it's really our responsibility to do to make this better, because these are a remarkable group of people coming and living in our countries. So this is a slide. I don't want you to look too much at details. I'll talk you through what I think is important. So this is just looking at what proportion of refugees live, you know, compared to the population in our countries. So basically, on this slide, Lebanon has about 209 refugees per 1,000 head of population. So Lebanon, with the Syrian refugee crisis, which is the largest mass movement of a population since World War II, is predominantly living in the neighboring countries to Syria. So compared to the 209 in Lebanon, the 90 in Jordan, Canada is probably one of the best countries of many of us represented here. They have 4 per 1,000 head of population. UK, we have about 1.8, Ireland similar, USA is about 0.8. So thinking about the global role that we're playing, it's actually pitiful, and actually we can actually do a much better job of it. So thinking about what are the influences for young refugees, if you meet them, if you think about them, I think it's useful to think about the pre-migration, the peri-migration, and the post-migration experiences, and the drawing of the Afghan boy that I showed you really does demonstrate that. But I think also we have to start thinking in the same way that Fazel challenged us and said, it's just, you know, there's no time now to not think in a more systemic manner. We need to think not only beyond the individual, to the needs of families, schools, and their communities, and the wider society and the policies at stake. So there are 2 things, I think, as a mental health professional that I take away now with working with this group. So one is exposure to traumatic events. Now, the reality is that many of us have experienced some sort of traumatic event, and avoidance often is a relatively successful way to deal with it. So I don't want you to think that every single refugee, even if they've experienced terrible traumatic events, need to sit down and talk to someone about it, and that is the only way that they'll recover, because the vast majority do fine. But there is a substantial proportion who have experienced such horrific traumatic events that will need proper evidence-based treatments. Now, the evidence-based treatments are overwhelmingly specialized treatments, they're exposure-based treatments, and actually they need to be available to these groups. So we need to have specialist centers. But I think the focus of what I want to talk about today is actually the post-migration environment. That is so important, and I put that as a cloud because I think it is an incredible cloud, and can we make it into a nice warm sun? So that kind of images like this, clearly not painted by the people who attend this church, but by vandals, of no refugees welcome, is absolutely just unacceptable. So what can we do when we're thinking about how best to support the mental health of these populations? So if you think about a young refugee, I just want to talk through kind of these different areas that I think are important. So we've got the individual needs of that young refugee, and like I said, I think that's about accessibility and availability of services. I think that when you think about exposure to previous traumatic events and those that are finding it difficult to manage because of that experience, avoidance is a key part of your recovery. So how in the world is a young person who doesn't understand mental health services, who doesn't know the people, who actually everything in their body is telling them to avoid any memory of this, is going to go to mental health services and talk about the worst thing that's ever happened to them? It's just kind of, just not going to happen, and that's what we find. It just doesn't happen. We've got a school in Oxford that has a large number of refugees at the school, and literally they're about 100 meters away from the main child outpatient service. And they leave school with every intention of coming to the hospital, and they just walk, past their home, often past a few shops, and the last thing they do is end up walking up the hill to our service. They're just going to go straight home. So we've got to think about the types of services that are needed and how to make them accessible. We've got to think about kind of the creative arts and working with this group as well. When it comes to PTSD and trauma, then I think we need those specific treatments, but that's the only place where I think we need them. I think group interventions are very important and useful for this group, but I think really the take-home from that aspect for me is about accessibility of services. What's been lacking, I think, for quite a while is thinking about what families need and the interventions for families. So schools get kind of 50 refugees arriving, and they're like, what should we do for the refugees? But actually, I think we really need to step back and think. These are disrupted families if they come with their families. Parents often are suffering from their own mental health problems. They often need support in parenting, just to kind of get back the parental role, because children often learn the language faster, acculturate faster, and all that seems to do is kind of eat away and take away from the parental role. And so what can we do to support parents in their parenting? And so many tensions seem to arise around cultural kind of values and what to do. And also I think just thinking about exposure to violence and cycles of violence, that actually having been exposed to terrible community violence, societal violence, can at times increase the likelihood of violence being manifest within the home. But we need to start thinking about it and talking about it. I've spent about 10 years working with refugees before we're actually really now thinking actually we have to be asking systematically about how we can support these families at very difficult times. Social interactions, well, that's kind of what society is it that we're welcoming these people to. These are the most developed nations in the world, we think, but in the manner in which we treat our welcome kind of visitors and new citizens doesn't necessarily attest to one that is that warm and welcoming socially. So thinking about social interactions, I think we need to think about how individuals can contribute to the economic and social capital of the communities in which they live. So people need to be allowed to work. People need, we all get so much out of work. Why is it the first thing that we deprive often these new communities? Thinking about living circumstances, minimizing moves. Many of the children I work with just have been moving non-stop. They seem to have an average of 5 moves within a year when they move to the UK alone. And then schools, so that's my particular area of interest. What do we do in schools to support them? I really think schools are such a key institution because they're everywhere. They're very different in the ways that they work and the communities and culture there, but actually schools are everywhere. Mental health services really are not everywhere. So I think we need to start thinking in creative ways about how we use the institution of schools, not necessarily teachers, because the vast majority of time teachers are completely overwhelmed and overburdened, but still the institution of schools. How can we work better in schools? So I've got an account I'd like to share with you of a refugee student, and I'll read it. So he goes, I don't know, find a way to try to make them feel welcome, because there's not so many people that makes them feel like they're welcome. Jamie was our main source in the way that he was the first person that made us feel welcome. He's a student, but he's the best one ever. You didn't have Jamie, we wouldn't be here. Nobody would know us. People liked Jamie, and he was a pole that makes the school stand up. I then asked, what did he do? Like, what is this? Like, he said he helped me. He didn't care who thought about what. He lost friends over helping us. Whatever we needed, the help was there. Even we needed money, we would ask Jamie. I'd say, Jamie, we need money to go there. Okay, here you go. He would give it. All right, obviously we borrowed the money, but he would do it. So this is kind of a young boy just talking about the value of just a local popular kid just befriending him. You know, he wasn't given a specific role by the school, this boy, to do it, but the school, I don't know, you know, the school might have had nothing to do with it, but a school can actually provide ways in the structured and unstructured environment of the school to enable these peer interactions to develop that actually those of us that work in kind of services, you know, removed from these situations can never do. The most potent interventions, I think, are completely unavailable for those of us in services, but are completely available in community settings, in schools. And I really think it's important to make sure that we make the most of that we let everyone understand this is, you know, completely within your reach to do something special, you know. So I spend a lot of time talking to teachers, you know, which children in the class are most likely to befriend, you know. What can you do to make them unaware of the fact that you're putting them together? And what small projects can you create? What can, you know, the schools can be creative. I can't do anything, I feel, in a mental health service. So what we did in Oxford was we built a school-based mental health service for refugee children. And we went to the school and we spoke with the link staff member of the school who knew all the refugees in that school. And I suppose the main aim of our service was that, you know, we didn't necessarily want to see the children at all. If we could make the environment one in which understood what was happening, supported, provided inputs that were needed, then that was for us the greatest success. But if we needed to see the young person, that the school would approach them. Would, you know, if there was a teacher that had the best relationship, that teacher would offer to accompany the young person to the first appointment or their family, that we would do that first appointment at the school and any subsequent appointment that felt right within the school environment. And this type of service then spread to 9 other centres around the UK, and then I had the opportunity to interview young people about what it was like, refugee children, what it was like to be seen at school. And what did they, you know, prefer? Now, 71% of them preferred to be seen at school than outside school. And I think that's probably about the right amount with any group that we've been working with subsequently. And, you know, if they didn't want to be seen at school, it's mainly because, well, if you don't like school, you're not going to want to be seen at school, you know, obviously. And if, you know, and those that didn't want to be seen at school often had privacy concerns, but they wanted to be seen in a more private location. Those that preferred to be seen at school said mainly because school felt safe. It was also convenient. They often recognised the therapists and were relatively happy to go and see them. They felt they could get back to their lessons on time, but predominantly it was safe. So now, you know, what's happened as a result of that from our learning about the wider impact? So we would go to these schools and say, you know, tell us about the refugee kids and what's going on, and we'd have this meeting. And then just as the meeting would end, the teachers go, right, thank you for that. Now can I talk to you about these 10 other children I'm worried about? That actually from a school perspective, there are vulnerable kids that they're worried about that they want to talk to us about, and it really doesn't matter to them what their background is. And as a result of that, we started the school, in Oxford, what we call an in-reach service, where we have a mental health worker, the same worker going to the same school at the same time every week. And we piloted this in 3 schools 3 years ago. It spread to 10, and now every secondary school in Oxfordshire has this. Now, I asked for 2 days a week. I only got half a day a week, so obviously there's a lot to do. But what you would find is that Schools, might have 30 children at the school seeing mental health services, but of those 30 kids, 20 different mental health practitioners would be going in, and the school system couldn't build a relationship where they could talk about children and that weren't being seen, and we could provide a more containing and helpful environment, that we could see children much sooner if they were discussed with us, or also identify other services needed. So as a result of working with these refugee children, I think services for all children in Oxford have dramatically improved because we've learned about access and we've learned about addressing needs. Thinking just finally about specific trauma-based therapies, there's a type of therapy called narrative exposure therapy that was developed for lay workers to deliver in refugee camps in Uganda. What we've learned is that because of the manner in which this therapy has been developed, that it's quick and easy to train people to deliver, it deals with multiple traumatic events, that actually the majority of UK NHS trauma centres now are using NET because they perceive themselves as poorly equipped, needing scalable solutions. So actually also interventions that have been developed for very different contexts are now relevant. So finally, very similar to what Faye was saying, we need to really think, when thinking about refugees, about the importance of community, importance of maintaining the dignity of these communities that are coming, how lucky we are that they're coming to our countries, really, and what role we can all play and our communities in helping them feel accepted. Thank you.